So hello and welcome to our program. Let me see if it is. Just want to make sure it's actually recording. Hey guys out there in the big wide virtual world, can somebody just let me know whether you can hear me? So if you can, it means that. Sì. Bene. Good. Yazoo. Yes, very good. Yep. Okay, thank you. So once again, welcome everyone to our program here, which is the study of our reality, really. And the point being that the more we know our reality, the less we tend to go wrong of it. With the less we tend to misunderstand reality. So the Buddhist teaching, oddly enough, despite what you might think, that actually Buddhists have a philosophy. They don't really. They have a critique of some of our assumptions. And they use a few words. So people might be tempted to say, well, Buddhists have a philosophy. But really what the Buddhist teaching is more about is just sort of to wake us up to actually taking a hard look at what we assume, whether it's valid or not. That's really all that's in it. And what we're doing now with the Abhidharma is more just looking at all the components of our perceptions and seeing, can we really find something solid the way that we think things are solid? And we can't. We can find a lot of conditions that come together. And the more we're aware of all these conditions, the more we understand that this so-called hard reality is not that hard. It's made up of parts. It can be disassembled. And it can be seen through. And so that's what we're doing. So please don't ever be overwhelmed by the how do you say, the appearance of there being a lot of analysis happening in Buddhism, because really it's more just sort of encouragement to actually take a hard critical look at what we assume is real. So I know a lot of you, you're a very critical bunch. So that's an asset. You're being encouraged to be critical. Don't be fooled. Okay, so we've looked at the components of our reality in terms of the dhatus. We've looked at the general composition of our experience in terms of emotions, more on the subjective level. And now we're going to look at what it effectively constitutes what we sometimes call the 51 mental factors, the mental events. And these are made up of different groups. We're going to look at something first that's called ever-present and object-determined mental factors. And again, please don't in any way be intimidated by or bored with and so on the terms that we have here, because they actually cover something that is immediately present. Again, like I'm banging on about a lot, is that while we could study a lot of theory that had to do with things that don't really we can't really immediately appreciate, you know, we could study all sorts of aspects of, let's say, biology or engineering, or we could talk about things that are distant. But when it comes to Abhidharma, we're always talking about what's happening right now with us right here. And Steven Goodman really goes out of his way to make this, you could say, very immediate and applicable. So that's where Steven's particular choice of words, they really reflect his his enthusiasm in terms of communicating the subject matter. Anyway, so we're going to refer here to the Abhidharma Kosha by Vasubandhu, which is the work that really is the foundation for what we're looking at here. And he says the list of 75 dharmas based on the Abhidharma Kosha by Vasubandhu is one way of talking about what makes up all of reality. We gave this list initially in discussions of Abhidharma because this is where one finds codified definitions, just the various groups. And this is again where we can look at that chart to your left, and that's essentially what the Abhidharma Kosha talks about. Then he says, now to discuss the mental factors, 13 to 58, and that of course, yes, you'll say that's essentially 45, not 51. I'm not exactly sure what the difference is, but we're more or less talking about the same thing. These are all things that happen to us. That's a good thing. So he says, to discuss these from this list in detail, I'm going to switch references and touch upon two other books that were written by Tibetans and have modern English translations. And these are then, both books are based on and follow the approach of the Abhidharma. The two references are Gateway to Knowledge by Jamgon Mipham. And Jamgon Mipham is quite a well-known entity, really. In Tibetan Buddhism, if you talk about Jamgon Mipham, he's kind of, it's a bit like talking about the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. It's just very common. If you listen to music, you're going to come across these guys. And if you come across studying Buddhism, particularly in this neighborhood here, you're going to come across Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche quite a lot. And Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche wrote a book called Gateway to Knowledge. And it's a work, Stephen continues, a work in which there is a list of all of these factors and definitions. I'd just like to say something about a gateway to knowledge, which is that it's a lot more than just the lists from the Abhidharma. It's really a compendium of the sutra teachings of the Buddha. It really is a place where everything that's worth knowing is sort of gathered, but it's very, very dense. It's like if you have an encyclopedia, it's just all there. You don't sit down and you read an encyclopedia sort of like, well, unless you're an insomniac, it's not what you sort of choose to read at night for your entertainment. And the Gateway of Knowledge is certainly not the kind of stuff that you'd read for fun. But if you're interested in the subject matter, then you'll find it in there. And again, this is where Jamgon Mipham is incredible, where he gathers material from so many different places. The other one, this is something that exists then again in English translation, is Mind in Buddhist Psychology, a work by a Tibetan Buddhist scholar, Yeshe Gyaltsen. He was incidentally a teacher of one of the Dalai Lamas, Yongzhen Yeshe Gyaltsen. And he lived then in the 18th century. And it says that elucidates the workings of the mind and its mental events. So this is a book that's been around since the 1970s. I was studying this when I was 19, and it's really actually a really helpful book. The Gateway of Knowledge is rather dense. Mind in Buddhist psychology is quite accessible, really. Anyway, in the back of this translation, there is a chart of the translators correlate, in which the translators correlate some of the factors found in Jamgon Mipham's Gateway to Knowledge with what Yeshe Gyaltsen explored. Basically, you just have in the back of the book, you have what they use, different terms they use. Anyway, both Mind in Buddhist Psychology, which is then MBP, and Gateway to Knowledge, abbreviated as GK, follow the approach of Vasubandhu, and they both refer to the Abhidharma literature for their technical definitions. As we explore these factors, I will provide the English translation for each factors as found in both the Gateway of Knowledge and Mind in Buddhist Psychology. You can see Appendix 2 for a complete list of these. So, general factors. There are 10 general factors, 5 ever-present factors, and 5 object-determined factors. So we'll see what that is. all of the general factors have something to do with paying attention or being with an object so that we can report to ourselves that we're having an experience. These are the basic factors involved in cognition. For those who are interested in cognitive science, you might be encouraged to study these 10 factors, see what they have to do with experience and how cognitive science explores the subject matter of these same factors. I'm not quite sure whether he's referring to contemporary cognitive science or Buddhist cognitive science. But anyway, what we are looking at here is obviously Buddhist cognitive science. These general factors do not have subdivisions at the level of how they actually are, but only at the level of how they operate in different ways. Okay, so we're not going to look at the ontology of this or how they actually exist, which is basically dependent arising like anything. But we're more looking at how we experience it. So, for example, if we look at perception, we're just looking at what perception means and how that plays out in terms of the object, in terms of the subject. As dharmas, as phenomena, they are irreducible to anything else. They're simply just stuff, phenomena, things that we experience. These factors, these energy packets, this is again Steven's fondness for, I guess, crossing over to contemporary science, and particularly quantum physics, I guess. These factors, these energy packets, are understood to be part of the fundamental building blocks of the universe. They are what actually makes up me and my environment. If we develop precision about the actual nature of these energy packets, then we may come to understand how they combine with other energy packets. And really the operative there is if we develop precision, because that's what we're trying to do, to be actually acutely aware of what's happening in terms of our experience. So that's where, so he continues, as suggested before, these factors combine with each other, like atoms combining with other atoms to make molecules and then larger chains of molecules. Whether we are investigating a plastic bottle or an experience, say being angry, we can physically and mentally, we can analytically tease apart the constituent elements, cutting through to the core of it with the crucial factor of discernment, prajna. That means we have a plastic bottle, but we also know that if we analyze it, we can see it's made up of different things. If we have an experience of being angry, well, we say, I'm angry, but then we can begin to analyze, well, what is it that constitutes my anger? Well, it's those people out there, they're just driving me nuts. And then we can analyze, well, what is it that we don't like about them? Is the t-shirts that they wear? No, it's the things they say and they do. Okay, well, what is it exactly that they said? Well, they said this. And then we begin to say, well, why did they say that? Etc. And then we go back to ourselves. Why is it you have a problem with that particular, you could say, vocabulary? Or why is it that you're being particularly sensitive today? And so on, etc. So we can always analyze. And the thing is, the moment that we begin to, like he says, tease apart what otherwise would just say, I'm angry at them, then we begin to see it's actually made up of many different elements that really, if you look at them, provide a picture of complexity to the extent that finally we won't actually see really if there's really any justification, any basis for this experience of anger. And that's a good thing, because anger is not particularly helpful. So that's where this quality of looking at things, what they actually are, is what we call prajna. And this we use a lot in the Dharma to cut through deception, cut through the things that drive our suffering. And it's not just that we shouldn't be angry, it's just that we're angry for no reason. The whole thing is a hoax, it's a delusion, it's a paper tiger. And we might be terrified of a tiger unless somebody shows us it's a stuffed tiger or a paper tiger or whatever. And then we see there's nothing to be upset about. So that's the quality of prajna. So as Vasubandhu says, when one discovers what is irreducible, then at that level one discovers what is actually real. So when we find out it is just a paper tiger, when we can take it down to that level, then actually we see what's actually there, But the point is also it frees us. It's not just that we become very smart or informed or we know the secret of the universe. It's just that actually it helps us. Okay. I hope the sound is still okay. So, understanding the scope and definitions of the full list of these factors, one should develop confidence that no aspects of reality are being left out. So that's again where when we analyze, we just get down to actually the place where we can't find anything that we can hold on to as being something that's solid as we thought about it before. And that's where it makes a lot of sense to actually really apply analysis. This is something that we do here. Here we are actually looking at what are the components that we're looking at. For example, if you look at the way of the Bodhisattva, or you look at Lojong teachings, it's the same thing that they will always say. Try and have a look at what seems to be so looming, overwhelming, and solid. So Steven says one can learn how our so-called life consists of nothing other than the ways in which these factors, like atoms, combine to make up our phenomenal reality. So, okay, here they come. The ever-present factors. So we have the first 5, which are then sensation or feeling tone, Vedana. Basically, just we say feeling, just that we experience something. Then, and it's very often on the basis of feeling that we just go, I like, I don't like. You know, this is good, this is bad. Then we have perception, but it's a bit more than just perception. It's actually where we begin to, it's samjnana, which is where we begin to have an idea about it. We begin to weave a narrative or a sort of you could say more of a concept about it. So the first is very, you could say, basic. The next one is more developed. And then we have chetana, attraction, or directionality, where we begin to actually have impulses in terms of I like this, I don't like that, and so forth. So it's the engagement. And then we have sparsha, which is contact, like feeling, where we're actually engaging. Again, the first chetana is more where we go towards something. Sparsha is more where we have actually contact with something. And then attention. This is then the concepts, manasikara, where we begin to have some, again, some concepts about it. But this is where we develop a whole story, really. So the first one, feeling or sensation or feeling tone. The first factor, Vedana, is a translation of sensation in Gateway of Knowledge and feeling tone in Mind and Buddhist psychology. Sensation, basic energy packet of Dharma, cannot be broken up. It's defined as 3 different types of experience. Anubhava, which is pleasant, sukha, sorry, 3 types of experience, anubhava. And then the first one then is pleasant, sukha. Then we have unpleasant, dukkha. And according to Vasubandhu, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, asukha, dukkha. A just means no. So it means no sukha and no dukkha. But okay, so there's some discussion about this. This basically just means that we have no, it's no this or that. You know? So we would say some writers call this last experience not determined, or they use a term that gets translated as neutral, shorthand meaning neither pleasant nor unpleasant. This is not a trivial point, particularly for those who have had some somatic training, and probably also for anybody who basically just experiences. Can one actually have a sensation that can be called truly neutral? Of course, we do have sensations that are not so easily classified as pleasant or unpleasant. This word neutral sounds like a balance, or it sounds a bit vague. But when one reads the commentaries, they clearly define this third way of sensation as the class of sensations that don't come to us as only pleasant or unpleasant. If we just stick with the words of Vasubandhu, there is pleasant, unpleasant, and neither. There is no neutral, undifferentiated, or indifferent. Okay, so that's where Stephen clearly wants us to make a point that when we're talking about these three, the last one is really just defined in just by not being pleasant or unpleasant. So he says it's okay. This, of course, is something that we have right now. Let's say that let's say that right now in this very moment, you might have liked to listen to teachings on the great perfection or stories of the great sages or something like that, and then you end up in a class of Abhidharma, and you might think, oh gosh, this is so intellectual and academic and boring. So that would fall under this falls into the department of dukkha. That is unpleasant. then you might actually be really interested in what's happening with the mind and find out how do the Buddhists actually really understand this whole business of mind, because they apparently know something about mind. Might be interesting. Wow, this is so interesting. So that's pleasant. And then you might just, there might be a little ant that's present here. And this ant has no relationship to anything that's going on, except it's just wondering where there might be something to eat, or maybe a mouse wondering if there's anything edible around or whatever. And what goes on here falls in neither the pleasant nor unpleasant category. So that's what we're talking about here. So that we have every micro moment, we have these experiences of feeling. So that's why we call it, this is an ever-present factor. So it is said, Stephen continues, that this factor of sensation within the Sutta of Mindfulness, Satipatthana Sutta, there is a procedure for reflecting on the nature of sensation. So by the way, this is a really important sutra. And so, for example, if you practiced shamatha and vipassana, and if you've been involved in any way in meditation as it's presented in the you can say in the modern world, and then particularly within the groups such as insight meditation and so on, there's a lot of reference to this particular sutra. So we talk about the 4 kinds of mindfulness and so on. So Satipatthana Sutra is really a key reference. And so in there it says there is a procedure for reflecting on the nature of cessation. So we look at how we actually would analyze this experience. So it says, furthermore, the grouping of conditioned factors into the 12-fold category called sense bases, or the ayatanas, is a way of paying attention to how this factor of sensation works. So this is, in fact, what's operative here is continually our experience with objects. So it's on the basis of, and this is actually also the second of what we call the 5 skandhas. First is, we would say that the whole condition, what's called samsara, is premised on this fundamental cognitive dysfunction in which you could say the natural luminous quality of consciousness is all of a sudden diminished into this self-consciousness that we then refer to in terms of me, I. So where the ground of experience is free from that self-reference, self-consciousness, at the time of the first skandha, which is then what we call form, there's all of a sudden a conception of experience in terms of self-referencing that we then call me. And on the basis of me, we then think other. And that's where we have this whole predicament of self and other. And this is what we generally would refer to as duality. And it's on the basis of that duality then that we begin to freeze our perceptions. Instead of having an open relationship to all our perceptions, then we begin to have a way in which we classify our perception in terms of like and don't like. So there's a very primitive initial binary moment where we actually just go like, not like. And it's then on the basis of that that we then eventually develop more elaborations, such as the narratives around it that we have in samjnana and also in the samskaras and so on. But anyway, what we're talking about here, purely in terms of just this ever-present experience of feeling, is essentially what's taking place within that duality of self and the object of what the self perceives. So Stephen continues, Vasubandhu states that the groupings of factors into 5 aggregates, skandhas, so that's what we just talked about, namely the skandha of form, where we conceive self and other, then feeling, like, dislike, conception or perception, which is then developing narratives such as good and bad, skandhas, which is then the way that we engage with phenomena in terms of impulse, and then finally consciousness that gathers all this back into a sense of person. So that's what we call the skandhas. And then we have the 18 elements, which essentially are, again, the experiences of the 5 senses as well as the mind. And that these 6 then operate in terms of the 5 senses, let's say the visual faculty, which has the eye, then it has the object, which is the object of perception of the eye, and then the consciousness that's generated on the basis of that. So for each of the 5 senses, and also the mind thinking in terms of its self, its perception, and the consciousness or mood that's generated on the basis of that. When we have these 6 and they then are understood in terms of these 3 aspects, subject, object, and consciousness, then that becomes these what we call 18 elements, the 18 dhatus. So that's what we looked at previously. And then we also have the 12 sense bases, which is again these basically the experience of subject and object in terms of the 5 senses and also mind. So again, 2 sets of 6. So all of these, and that really is, these really are the foundations of what we call Abhidharma. And it's really the basis for our analysis of what we then experience. All of these are studied to counteract a wrong belief regarding the status of an imagined stable self, Atma. So that's where, of course, this is what that runs as a red thread through the entire Buddhist path, is really us examining this assumption around ourself. And this we basically approach, certainly in the context of the theory, in terms of analysis, hard analysis, and also in terms of intuitive assessment of how the tightness around self generates suffering, and when we relax this, how it creates greater experience of durable happiness. And then, of course, that then serves as the foundation for you could say, the vision that then is integrated through the practice of meditation. So, as far as then the 12 sense bases goes, Stephen says, these are said to be an antidote for the wrong view of the self, the sense of who I am, and is made, the sense of who I am is made up of actually existing material stuff. This wrong view seems to be similar to many Western materialist views, such as neural net advocates. So basically, the moment that we identify the constructed nature of self and our perception, we can see that the assumption that there is a solid, enduring self is really challenged. And we can see that all of this really comes from a number of conditions that come together. I'll pass on commenting here on what Stephen is referring to, the neural net advocates, since I'm not quite sure what that would mean. It's probably within neuroscience that neuroscience that we talk about neural correlation and so forth, but I'll pass on that one. And sadly, Peter's not here today. Otherwise, I'm sure I don't know if anybody else is familiar with neural networks, but I might just pass on that wisely, I think. Anyway, such views, Stephen says, does not allow the seemingly soft notions of mind and mental events to enter into their analysis. Okay, so whenever we talk about soft in the sort of scientific department, it really falls into what then we call phenomenology. And that's where the experience as such, the actual feeling of what it's like to actually be alive and live and so on, that's actually not the department of the people doing this kind of neural network science. So they more operate than what they would call the hard notions of mind. Anyway, materialists, Steven says, believe that all experience must be based on brain or brain-related material structures and events, which must in turn be based on neurochemistry or perhaps physics. That's, of course, where we would purely see all our experiences as a human being as purely in terms of neurons firing and so forth. Okay. Yeah, then soft is then, as opposed to that kind of hard, you can even say, like Steven says, physics, neurochemistry, that just sees everything that we experience purely in terms of just essentially mathematics, equations, and what's going on. Right? That's, they would say, that's what's actually happening. And everything else is kind of something folksy, like feeling, you know? The feeling of actually, you know, you might be happy. But they would say, well, there's no such a thing as happiness. It's all just, you know, it's just neurons firing, you know? Stop talking rubbish. We don't operate with feeling and so forth. So they would purely, so hard science would purely see what we experience as feeling. They would just see in terms of what's taking place in terms of neurons and so forth, right? So yeah. So he says, then somebody, thank you very much, somebody very kindly is volunteering some info. A neural network is a series of algorithms that endeavors to recognize underlying relationships in a set of data through a process that mimics the way the human brain operates. Well, yes, exactly. So thank you. But that's basically what we can say then is how materialism explains what we then refer to as just our soft or our actual experience. So yes, so that's where science would like to essentially, I guess we could say, reduce the experience that we have, which of course we can't properly put language to. We can never properly explain fully what it's like to be who we are, or what love is like, or what anger is like, and so forth. And that's where you could say within neuroscience, then you'd like to rather just say, okay, this is, like you're saying here, it's a set of data. So this is where we yeah, that would be very soft. Yeah, yes, yeah. But that's true, and that's of course where there's a big gap between what you call the hard sciences and the soft sciences. They sometimes don't talk together, sadly. The point here is, because actually what we're doing with the Abhidharma is actually we are providing a certain hard dimension. We're just not leaving it as sort of a vague topic. We're quite precise. But at the same time, we're not reducing it also to just being something that is purely understood in terms of abstracts, like mathematics or algorithms. So that's where the first person experience is actually valid. What you try to do with neuroscience around these things is you try to reduce it to a third person experience, so you can objectively say, okay, this person is experiencing this. But the truth of the matter, I was just talking to a neuroscientist yesterday about this, is that you're going to have all the algorithms down there, but you're still going to depend on a first person experience to say what that feeling was. You cannot read anger or whatever it might be, the mood, you cannot read it from just having algorithms. You can't read it from just mapping the firing of the neurons. You can see the correlation possibly, but you would need to know initially, you need to have a first person who actually says, well, this is what I felt. So at the end of the day, it's a little bit lacking. And this, of course, is part of what then is known as the hard problem of science. Its consciousness is just not properly understood. What we're doing with the Abhidharma Kosha and what's being presented here is something that we can actually verify in terms of our immediate experience. So as much as you can say it's dealing with something that is soft, our felt experience, it's also empirical. It's verifiable. It's something that we can observe and know from our own experience. The only thing is we can't put it out and turn it into an algorithm or a third person, something that can be observed by a third person. It is, you can say, private, something that we each experience, but that doesn't make it less real. That's why there are people, certainly people like B. Alan Wallace, who make a big point about how we need to redefine how we understand empiricism. If we're going to approach Buddhism as a science, we're going to have to redefine empiricism. We're going to have to include first-person experience because it is real. It's just not something that we can put under a microscope. It's not quantifiable. It's not.
So, and yet we're coming back to one's personal experience.
That's a very good question. So how does that apply to our understanding self? Well, the thing is, the more we understand that things are composed of many different things, we can see their constructs. We can see that there is no single self. There's just a lot of different conditions that appear to be a self, just like me. Let's face it, you can't find me. Sorry, it's just a ever-changing construct. And it's actually Steven here, and that's why I've highlighted that. He says, the point here is the Abhidharma Kosha asserts that the 12-fold sense bases are taught in order to be able to cut through the wrong view that the so-called self consists of solid material stuff. So we can't find anything, certainly we can't find anything material. The whole sense of what we experience is based on subject-object interaction. So the procedure that is used to do this is to discover the sensations, that these sensations are more or less always there. They accompany all our experiences. In other words, awareness or mind, and its function is always there when there is contact, sparsha, via any of the channels. So this is, of course, what we've looked at in terms of the data analysis that we began this study with. This is but one example of how the Abhidharma literature refers to certain groupings of this list of factors in order to counteract wrong views, which are regarded as the source of suffering. So, of course, wrong view here is not that it's, it's not orthodox, or it's not okay, or the Buddhists don't like it, but just that it's essentially delusion. So wrong view doesn't mean that somebody doesn't like it. It's just that, just like when we have this example of the rope that we misperceive as a snake. So then we would say, if you're walking along the path and all of a sudden you come across this snake in the path, and then somebody nudges us and say, hey, take a look, it's not really a snake, it's a rope, then actually they have what we call then dispelled the wrong view. Our misperception that there was a snake, that's what we mean with wrong view. And of course, the point here is that that's why sentient beings, they suffer, because they're attributing solidity to something that doesn't have solidity. That's what we're answering here. Let's see what the question is. Does Abhidharma essentially lead to an understanding of shunyata? I just wonder where Abhidharma sits in the Dharma teaching, in which turning of the wheel. Okay, it's actually first turning. It doesn't necessarily lead to an understanding of shunyata, but it does lead to an understanding of dependent arising, Pada. And why it doesn't lead to an understanding of shunyata is because it still operates with an actual existing consciousness, and it still operates with an actual existing, well, they still believe in atoms at the level of Abhidharma. But again, there are some of the Abhidharma teachers who were Mahayanists, like Dhammakirti, and also Vasubandhu eventually became a Mahayanist, became Shunyata Vaden, I guess we can call it. But that's almost, yeah, the lines are somewhat blur. Well, the thing is, we would say this analysis is very helpful. Just like, if we, like I was saying before, we get angry at somebody, and then we begin to analyze, what is it we don't like about that person? Is it their T-shirt, or the way they talk, or is it that they use a particular vocabulary, or that they call us a rude name? What is it we don't like about them? The more we analyze, the more the sort of the anger subsides, right? It sort of peters out in the midst of this analysis, right? And that's where complexity, or the understanding of dependent arising, is very helpful. So even if we don't arrive at a complete understanding of shunyata, still just understanding dependent arising allows for much you could say, less rigid relationship to our reality. So that's where this is very helpful. But there is, yes, there is a difference then between those that would say there is still some substance in terms of consciousness and in terms of the outer world, and those who would say, well, even these objects in terms of consciousness or the outer world, they're subject to the same laws that apply when we analyze anything. But the more you analyze it, you end up not finding anything. So that's where shunyata comes into the picture eventually. So Steven says we can appreciate how exploring this one factor can lead to a deep revaluing of our experience. Such study aids in cutting through the idea that the stuff of experience is material or substantial. So yes, we're cutting through the idea that things are material, but not necessarily leading to a complete understanding of shunyata. That was the first one. That was Vedana, feeling. Okay? Any questions before we continue with the next part? Okay. You could have chosen a happy hour down at the pub, but you chose to come here, so we'll just keep going. Perception, conceptualization. The second factor, samjhana, has been translated as perception, and mind in Buddhist psychology translates this as conceptualization. The definition of conceptualization is that it is the dharma or factor which can isolate or pick out a specific characteristic. Okay, so we start off with feeling, which, like I said, is very binary. We sometimes could refer to it as primitive, but just basic. It's just that basic sense, like, dislike. But then we begin to think of it more in terms of having a characteristic. There's a little bit more of conceptual embellishment taking place. Again, this is something that happens at every micro moment. So Steven says it's what allows us to tune into, in a very fine way, the proper category of what we may focus on. It is the aspect of mental functioning that allows us to pick out a specific characteristic. It's the ability to sort. What we still call concepts are the names we give to having been able to make distinctions at a mental level. Both in the Buddhist traditions as well as in the West, there's a lot of deep talk on how we come up with categories and in what ways our categories correspond to reality. That is, how we can sort things into proper categories. So, but here we're then again not particularly going much further than just, I look at this object in front of me here, this black thing, and I might sort of have a rather neutral relationship. I'm not particularly having sukha or dukkha in relation to looking at this chair, right? It's just chair, but I nevertheless label it as chair. So I'm already developing some degree of conceptualization with regards to that object, right? So Steven, being from the East Bay of San Francisco and neighbor of Berkeley, he sort of referring to some of the local pundits there, he says there was a very influential discovery about category formation by University of California at Berkeley professor of psychology, Eleanor Rosch. She is one of the three authors who wrote the book Embodied Mind. Let's see what that is. Okay, interesting. Yeah, because the other guys then, they're quite familiar entities or quantities. There's Francesco Varela and Evan Thompson and Eleanor Rosch, the Embodied Mind. Okay, so in fact, this is I know some of you have been studying this work. But anyway, particularly Francesco Varela, but also Evan Thompson. And I didn't know about Eleanor Rosch, but these guys have been really quite helpful in terms of, you could say, developing the language and the vocabulary that enables neuroscience and Buddhism to be in a dialogue. So Francesco Varela did a tremendous job, and he was also one of the founders of the Mind Life Institute. which is where you have dialogue between people like the Dalai Lama and people like Richie Davidson and so on. Can I understand that samjnana, perception, conception, as dependent designation and merely labeling of objects? Well, in and of itself, okay, hold on. Yeah. We can. Let's just go with that. That's fine. We can use this as a way of. We can say that is how we label things. Like I look at an object and I say chair. Sure. Anyway, let's see what Eleanor Roche says. So anyway, she's one of the three authors who wrote the book Embodied Mind, in which they tried to bring together Buddhist understandings and Western psychological understandings of mind and its functioning. Years before that, in 1978, Roche made a breakthrough. She discovered that in terms of category formation, there is nothing abstract or ideal about categories with respect to our experience. For example, there's not an ideal type or category for something called bird with respect to which we then learn to identify and associate a particular existent bird as being an element or an example of that set called birds. The discovery seemed to go against prevailing views about category formation. Actually, also Michel Foucault in France, he made this discovery when he wrote this thing called the Lemur that shows the order of things, the order of things, where the way that we categorize things are so random, actually. And he was talking about how in the old China they would categorize things in ways that would be completely incomprehensible for us. So yes, the way that we understand bird is something that's very much assumed to be sort of covering a large familiar group, but it's not necessarily like that. So he says, by working with a tribe in New Guinea, Rush discovered that there were prototypical existent birds and that people classed as birds those animals that closely resembled that specific type of a bird. That is to say, the class birds meant for that group of people whatever corresponded to a specific kind of bird. Rush was able to show that what we ourselves might think would be called a bird did not always correspond to what they called a bird. They had in mind a prototype, an actual living experiential example of a bird. The implication regarding category formation based on her work suggests that the classes of categories, which are considered general and a bit abstract, are actually never given in experience as such. They are inferentially based on actual prototypes. This suggests that there is no abstract notion of bird. Bird means anything that looks and acts like that specific prototypical bird. If a supposed bird deviates too much from the prototype, it will not be referred to as a bird in the language and experience of a given group of people. Prototypical structure of category formation caused a revolution against the notion that categories somehow exist out there as abstract things. Okay, so for example, we could say an ostrich, right? Now, from that point of view, then ostrich might be classified along with horse, just because it runs along the ground, right? We tend to just say, well, ostrich is a bird, even though it doesn't fly, because it has all these kind of, you could say, features that we think are just absolutely set in stone, but it's not necessarily like that. So he says, this is useful to remember when contemplating Buddhist accounts of what is happening at the level of experience. It seems we have an imprecise way of sorting out our experience in terms of categories. Eleanor Roche, along with Francesco Varela and Evan Thompson, thought deeply about how categories are formed. They concluded that mind and cognition in the Buddhist tradition refers to embodied experience as knowing, the different ways in which we experience. Mind is, in that sense, always an embodied knowing. So, for example, we would say, okay, I classify this as chair, but of course that is uniquely something that is taking place within my mind, and I'm labeling this as a particular in a particular way, but that again takes place, doesn't really exist in the object itself. It exists on the way that I label things. Let's see what they say here. So okay, that's Elena Rush and Beeline. Cognition and categorization. Okay. So there was a very the factor called idea or conceptualization is also one of the 5 aggregation skandhas. Idea or conceptualization is defined as the capacity to grab or isolate certain recurring factors. In English, the term concept means grabbing onto something. The same sense is found in Latin and in German. Both the Latin conceptus and the German Begriff, which comes from begreifen, convey a sense of grabbing on or selecting. The Buddhist view, we might say, is that for most people, there is a conflation or a confusion between our concepts and our reality. Okay, so one thing is that we begin to have a sense of the world around us, which really is something that is uniquely constructed in terms of how we personally project this world. So we all have our own unique way of seeing the world. We freeze the world. We're actually not seeing a fluid world, but we're seeing a world that's broken down according to how we choose to see it. So this is something also that's a theme in quantum physics, really, that we talk about quantum breakdown, where we actually freeze experience, where there's a, you could say, an infinite field of possibilities. But then once we've done that, then we have this basic like and dislike. Then we begin to attribute solidity in terms of the forms that we're perceiving. So I, for example, I give the label chair to this thing there. And that's where we then begin to say, well, that's real. But in fact, this is just me who has a very subjective experience of that. You know, a mouse would see this entirely different. I could get into an argument with a mouse. The mouse would just say, well, you know, that's a useless piece of object there. And I say, no, it's a chair. It's a chair. It's a very, it costs, you know, it costs $48 at IKEA and so on. And of course, the mouse and I, we would have vastly different perceptions. And that's where it says justified here that we might actually conflate our concepts, this being a chair, this we might take for being real. But in fact, this is entirely just a sort of anthropocentric. This is a human-made label according to our particular convention. Absolutely. Yeah. 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 Well, that's right. Yeah. 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 So yes, there's a question here then, don't we all as humans share that perception? And that's right. So we particularly who then share a conventional perception as humans will have that view. And others will have different views, you know, like, I don't know, spiders will have a different view and so on. But it's true. Then within the particular categories, then we have shared perception. But that's where we could almost say, hey, wait a minute, that's all very good, but it is a chair at the end of the day, right? And that's where we conflate, we confuse our concepts and reality. So he says, our capacity to show that our mind is able to make distinctions that correspond to reality depend a great deal on this factor called conceptualization. So this is samjnana. If there's a defect in our ability to pick out a specific characteristic, it's very difficult to have a precise experience in our lives. So we might come in from, you know, Tralfamador or Andromeda or something, and we might sort of stumble around in the world and encounter all these objects, and we wouldn't be able to make sense of it. You know? Just like if maybe we lived in the backwoods of Papua New Guinea and we get sort of dropped on Times Square in New York, then it's very difficult for us to actually make sense of what's there. So he says, we can read about this at some length, but it's enough to know that it's a name for being able to pick out or grasp a distinguishing feature, a specific characteristic. So this is really, really helpful in terms of us in our relating with the phenomenal world, the other people, the objects, and so on. That we actually understand this exists pretty much in terms of our what we could call projection. It's something that is constructed on the basis of first freezing reality in a particular way, then having a sort of a pleasant, unpleasant relationship with it, and then embellishing onto then giving it a particular label. This, of course, then goes further then when we begin to interact with the phenomenal world. But it is where we begin to identify that all of this is created by the projecting mind that we fixate on. So, interesting that categorization and classifications rely on the process of seeing similarity and hence relies on constant comparisons and sorting. Well, that's what we do, but we do so incredibly quickly. And of course, we end up just saying this has been like this for a very long time. Hence, we don't even question it. And of course, this is where we then come in and we're taking a fresh look at reality. This is interesting. Some of us probably experienced this if we were kids and we were doing drugs, and then all of a sudden we'd look at a hole in the wall, right? We just go, wow, a hole in the wall. We had these like far out experiences. And I was talking to this neuroscientist yesterday, and actually therapy nowadays is actually working with this kind of, with psychotropics, actually to release people from their fixations, re-evaluating their experience. Very interesting. Anyway, don't do drugs. Can I understand? Can I understand that Buddhist practice is to recognize that we are conceptualizing and to let our reification go, undo the perception conceptualization? Yeah, very much. Like I started off saying, we might think that there is such a thing as Buddhist philosophy, but actually what we have is really just a critique of our assumptions around reality. And in dismantling these assumptions and rigidity, we actually begin to discover reality free from that. So it's not just that it's definitely part of, it's not the ultimate, but it's part of the Buddhist methodology to, yes, let go of these reifications or conceptualizations, yes. So if our inability to differentiate qualities in our experiences means we cannot make sense of it, that suggests we're not constructing that reality. Not necessarily, because we could just be lost, and there's not really a quality of discerning. So that's again where just sort of generally not making sense of things doesn't necessarily mean wisdom. But at the same time, in having clear perception and yet not being fooled by the projecting subject, that enables us to appreciate our reality in a greater way. So it's a little bit subtle there. Otherwise, just sort of knocking ourselves out might be taken for sort of freeing ourselves from conceptualizing. I'm thinking, for instance, of meditation experiences. Yeah, that's true. I mean, when we're meditating, we're training ourselves in, that's right, we're training ourselves in not latching on to the narratives that we ordinarily blindly subject ourselves to and are controlled by. But that still possesses a dimension of insight. That is not just that we're not having, you could say, the usual addiction or fascination or fixation, but also means that we begin to see things, we know it, but at the same time we see the aerial perspective. So that's where we have two kinds of knowing. One is knowing how we ordinarily are entangled, and also knowing how we're free from it. Does an awakened being, for example, a Buddha, perceive and conceive? Wow, that's one of those big questions. But I have to say no. Strictly speaking, we would say no, a Buddha doesn't perceive and conceive. The Buddha has become, because concept necessarily is tangled up in this limitation of our reality. So strictly speaking, if we use the vocab of the five skandhas, where perception and conception implies that we're actually, you could say, pigeonholing reality into particular classifications, we say, no, a Buddha doesn't do that. But we would also say a Buddha possesses two wisdoms. One is knowing things how they are, namely knowing that they don't possess anything that can be objectified or grasped, but at the same time also know how things are perceived in their variety. So that's understanding how sentient beings, they would perceive things. And that's why the Buddha or the Dalai Lama can talk our language, because they would know how we experience things. So we talk about these two wisdoms of a Buddha. One is knowing things as they are, and the other is knowing things in their variety. Jitawa and Jinyepa, Kempa in Tibetan. Okay, I'm leaving it at that. So, end of concepts, end of the Begreifungen. All right. By this merit, we all attain omniscience, may defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, all age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish, ever more and more. Thank you. We'll just have a 2-minute break, and then we'll talk a bit about meditation for a while, and then after a while, we'll do some meditation. Thank you. Okay. So then the second component of our program is then the meditation, and my ever present ambition to make anything we're doing here very inclusive actually prompts me to always assume that, or rather, never assume that anybody just knows everything about Buddhist meditation, even though I suspect all of you actually do. But again, in the spirit of inclusion, then I'll just say something a little bit basic about the practice of Buddhist meditation. And so, like we were looking at before with the Abhidharma study, the Buddha's approach to freedom and extraction from confusion that drives suffering really lies in looking at our reality. And so what we understand as vipassana, which is not just a limited technique as such, really, in the Buddhist teaching, vipassana really means to properly see, to fully see. And what's so attractive about the Buddha is that the Buddha was never about rolling out a set of dogmas or systems. And even though, of course, in the Buddhist teaching, we have language and we have ways, what we call skillful means, in order to dismantle our confusion, then the objective as such is actually seeing reality free from our normal stumbling blocks, which are these obscuring factors that get in the way. And what we looked at before was the issue that we have, that we solidify things without actually looking at what things are. So the approach of vipassana really is that we just begin to settle into being fully present in our reality. And of course, we do this on one hand, theoretically, through analysis and looking at things, just like if we're talking with people who might be completely, you say, caught up in their particular worldview. We would say maybe to them, well, you know, like I said before, you know, somebody might be angry at somebody. We might say, what is it that you don't like about that person? And the more we actually analyze things, the more actually all these the complexity of the issue becomes so evident that anger diminishes, and we begin actually to relate more with the actual person and the actual reality. So that's what we're doing with analysis. But we're not just doing it in terms of theory, but also in terms of enabling ourselves to connect with reality, to actually be present in reality. So the conceptual mind, the mind that so easily goes into a rigid sense of self and other, and the embellishments and conceptualizations and attitudes that really, you could say, fuel this alienation with our world, and that really, so you could say, stiffens or creates this the way that we diminish our world into just categories, and we operate with judgments and so forth. What really enables us to open up is really that we're not so caught up in that mind that does that. That's what we do with meditation practice. Of course, meditation is very often presented as a way that we retreat from the world, that we sort of go into a sort of rarefied space. But in Buddhism, actually, meditation is not so much a retreating from the world as actually us beginning to connect with the world. But we do need to have a place of peace in which we actually can experience. And so often when we're active, and then there's a lot of speed that gets in the way, and we don't realize it, but there's an undertone, an undercurrent of our attitudes that actually continually inform our relationship with the world around us. So meditation is really just to provide a place where we could have some some peace and actually begin to be fully, properly present within our reality, that we actually begin to experience being fully who we are, and without necessarily latching on to all these narratives that run through our mind, these attitudes of good and bad and so forth. And that doesn't mean that all of a sudden we just become sort of like a vegetable and everything is just fine, but it really means that we begin to be more sensitive to the complexity and the texture of the world around it. It really opens us up to be more willing to take on the world as it is in its raw reality, rather than what we tend to do, which is all the time operate within a process of censoring. There's this that I like and this that I don't like, and there's the narratives that sort of, you could say, substantiate these attitudes. And so, of course, what's beautiful about the Buddha and what's beautiful about the Dalai Lama and what's beautiful about the sage, a sage in general, is actually the openness and the peace that exists between the individual and then the experience of life as it comes. Because we can't really choose what happens in our life, but we can work with the one that experiences life. And so that's where the Indian sage Shantideva, he says, we might want the world to be a soft, pleasant place, but that might be difficult. It's a bit like wanting to cover the whole world in soft leather that we could walk on. Of course, apologies to vegans and so forth, but the image really is that we just like to cushion the world and make it ideal. He says this actually is achieved if we just put leather under our feet. Then everything is workable then. And so the project of meditation is really to enable the mind to settle and to actually be properly present and allow a space where we're not necessarily activating and engaging this ordinary mind that continually dictates the way that we react to things. So we talk about two aspects of meditation. One is what we call shamatha, or calm abiding, which is the practice of physically sitting and also psychologically bringing the mind back to being present. So that's called shamatha, or calm abiding. And the other aspect that comes from that is vipassana. And again, like in the Burmese tradition, we talk about vipassana meditation. That's different because that is, in fact, a combination of both shamatha and vipassana. And that's really more just referring to a particular technique. But in general, in the Buddhist context, vipassana just means aerial perspective, that we begin to see things devoid of our particular self-centered optics, that we begin to see things more in terms of what vipassana literally means, a wider perspective. So it is that we begin to see things more with a sense of humor, more with a sense of perspective that's not necessarily centered on ourselves. So, and this is then what we would choose to call wisdom. So what we very often have is confusion, which is very much about our self-centered version of the world, and vipassana is more the way that we engage the world without necessarily that self-centering. But what that requires, to extract ourselves from this self-centering, it requires that we begin to actually question our assumptions, and that's what we do with the theoretical component, and that's what we call the prajna of analysis, or the prajna of study, or the prajna of theory, and then what we call the prajna of meditation. And that's the prajna that we develop through being properly present and beginning to see through the hoax and see through the control that the conceptual mind ordinarily imposes on us. This is basically where we free the mind. Now, we have a lot of cliches about freeing the mind. Well, you could just say, free your mind, man, and or you can have all these sort of expressions, sort of, people would say, just be here now, or just let go of things, or like that. But it's not so easy, because the reality is that we tend to rather stubbornly hold on to our particular version of things. And that's where the practice of meditation has a lot to do with, on one hand, the insight that we gain, but also a lot to do with the humility that actually comes from realizing how much we're governed by our self-centered projection. So in a way, meditation, despite it being something that potentially could bring about enlightenment, it could bring about a greater insight, it also has a lot to do actually with humbly recognizing the degree of our confusion. And one of sort of the disarming qualities of someone like the Dalai Lama, I was just watching a docu about the Dalai Lama yesterday, is his sort of real candor in presenting his own shortcomings. And that's luckily sort of something that sort of tends to be the hallmark of great Buddhist teachers, is actually that they have a lot of, you could say, self-irony and ability to laugh at their own, you could say, shortcomings. The Dalai Lama, he sometimes jokes. He says, all the compassion that he has, if he has any, comes from his mother. And then he says his short-temperedness comes from his dad. And then he'll sort of mimic how he gets short-tempered, and it's actually an interesting fact that the more actually we acknowledge our shortcomings, the more actually we externalize them, and the less actually we're caught up in them. And one of the beautiful things that we do with meditation is actually that we're aware of what's happening in the mind without necessarily identifying with it, without necessarily allowing these impulses or thoughts to, you could say, us becoming absorbed by them. So that's where, when we're practicing meditation, there is an awareness that is there, and yet at the same time that we're aware of what arises in the mind, we don't get entangled in it the way that we ordinarily do. And how we do that, practically speaking, is through then the practice of shamatha, or what we nowadays refer to generally as mindfulness, that we have a way of coming back to something that anchors us in connecting with being properly present and not distracted. And that would mean, for example, awareness of the breath. So that's where it's very helpful to be seated and not moving too much, because that's where we could actually sustain this focus. The focus, however, is not intended to engage some condition of trance or incredible ability to concentrate or all of that, but it's more just that it's really something that is sort of like the rock when there is a stream of thoughts that we ordinarily just sort of get washed away by. And that's where the practice of mindfulness is really a method of enabling us to remain properly present, properly connected. Of course, what that again brings along is, again, the humble recognition that we're incredibly distracted. And so when we sit down and meditate and we say, okay, now I'm going to meditate, then we generally discover that we're actually, first of all, we've been promised having no thoughts, right? Although everybody tells us meditation is where you sit down and you don't have any thoughts, and then you sit down and that's where you really find out how many thoughts you actually have. So then, of course, you could want your money back and say, I'm giving up on this. But in fact, it's just being aware of, it's where finally having a place where we become aware of how many thoughts we actually have and how they tend to absorb us. And that's where we also discover that not only are we having thoughts, but we're also just blindly getting carried away and absorbed by them. So meditation doesn't necessarily mean that we just all of a sudden go into a trance state, but it's rather that we become, you could say, discerning consumers of our ordinary mind, and we become aware of what it is actually that tends to deceive us and control us. And that's where meditation can very well be seen as an act of rebellion, in the sense of us not necessarily refusing to tag along with the mind, but just being discerning about the fact that thoughts come up and we tend to get carried away by them. And merely discovering that in itself is insight. So it's not just that we're sort of right away going to a deep meditative state, but it's more that we begin to become aware of what's actually happening within our mind. Now, the technique that we apply here has three aspects. And that is first the physical aspect, which is the body, and that is sitting straight. We don't necessarily have to sit on the floor, but just having a straight spine is very helpful. We would say if the spine is straight, that also means that what we call the nadis, or the sort of the channels, the meridians of the body, they're straight, and that allows for the prana or the chi to flow more freely, and correspondingly also then the mind, the bindu or consciousness, becomes more clear. So that's very helpful, and that's where we can create a foundation of a physical framework of calm. And then the second aspect is being directing our focus to the out breath. So that's where we, as we're sitting, then being aware of our breath, and then actually being just attentive to the fact, the knowledge that we are breathing out. We can't exactly see our breath as it exits from our nostrils, but we know that we're breathing, we're sensitive to it, and we could just be attentive to breath as it exits from our nostrils, and then how it fuses in space. And in my tradition, we actually emphasize the attention to the out breath, simply because it's what connects us with the other. And it's what enables us to some degree break down the barrier between self and other. So there's a lot of emphasis on the out breath. And we would say when we then have the in breath, we just let it happen without any particular focus. And then again, attention to the out breath. And that literally means that we have attention, gap, attention. So that means that we're not really entering into some kind of trance-like state when we're meditating, but it's more that we come back to the out breath and fusing with the space where we are. So in that sense, the out breath is the object of our mindfulness. We have that as the object of attention when we're meditating. And that actually means that in terms of what we do when we meditate, it's very, very sparse, very minimalist. It's really just that the meditation in terms of what we're doing is that we sustain a posture, and then we focus on the out breath. That's pretty much what we're doing. What tends to get in the way of meditation sometimes is that we think that something's supposed to happen. We're supposed to become incredibly sort of at one with the universe, or there's something special that's supposed to happen, or something particular. And that's where we could be a bit like the cat waiting for the mouse to come out. We're sort of just waiting for something to happen, and then if something happens, then we say, "Oh, I had a really good meditation there." that really just would become another addiction. It would just become another thing that we could hang on to. And that's actually not what we're doing. We're just actually familiarizing ourselves with the basic stuff of the mind at all times. So that's where we're not particularly waiting for anything to happen, but we are attentive to the fact that what happens to the mind all the time, which is we are having thoughts. What is special about meditation is when we are sitting, then we can actually be aware of what is happening. We're no longer just in the dark because we're attentive to also we're driving cars, or we're speaking with people, or we're engaged with our work, or whatever it might be. Here, actually, we have the privileged position of sustaining attention with regards to what's happening in the mind. And we can see thoughts arise, concepts. They can be in relation to our perceptions, the five senses. It can also be thoughts themselves, like we talked about before. In Buddhism, we talk about the six consciousnesses, where we also include the mind as one of these consciousnesses, not just the consciousnesses of the five senses. And that's where being attentive to whatever arises in the mind is a privileged position where it doesn't really happen unconsciously. And that's where we could discover that thoughts could arise in the mind, and they don't really attain the authority that they ordinarily do. Ordinarily, thoughts arise in the mind because we're not really attentive to them. They just actually become big with incredible power over us. But if we sit with an awareness and just coming back to the breath, and we're aware of thoughts, narratives, ruminations, memories that arise, we could practice then mindfulness, which is being aware of what's arising in the mind and yet not fixating on it, not being absorbed the way that we ordinarily do. And that's where the arisings of the mind don't necessarily attain the authority that they normally exert over us. So this is where we have this possibility of freedom. And that's where we're not doing anything with the thoughts, but we're just not succumbing to the authority and the tyranny or the grip that they normally have on us. And that's where we begin to have this freedom from thoughts, not just that we're sort of tuning into some extraordinary state, but it's more that we become discerning in terms of what's happening in our mind. And that's where meditation can provide peace. It doesn't mean that thoughts go away, but it means that we could actually make peace with whatever arises in the mind. So that is what we then refer to as vipassana, that there's an undistracted condition in which thoughts no longer they constitutes this this sort of looming what can we call it? This doesn't necessarily have the same grip on us. That perspective on thoughts then is what we refer to as vipassana. So the first two aspects has to do with the body and the attention to the breath, and that's what we do. And the last one has less to do with the doing, but has more to do with simply just being. And that's more about just as the thoughts arise, to simply just label them as thoughts, and really just allow them to be without necessarily getting distracted by thoughts and entangled in them. Now that's the theory, at least. The reality is, as we sit down and we're meditating, then we find out continually that we're distracted. So that's where, when we're meditating, then when we discover that we're distracted, to not make a big deal out of that, and simply just the actual recognition that we are distracted is actually non-distraction. So the moment that we're sitting there wondering if we've shopped for the dinner party tomorrow, or recollecting a conversation we had earlier today, or whatever it might be, and then we suddenly think, hey, wait a minute, I was supposed to be meditating, and come back to the breath. That moment that we recognize that we're distracted, that in itself is mindfulness. And then we don't need to embellish beyond that. And it's completely predictable that we will be distracted. And that's been our habit for a very long time. So we should expect it to be distracted. At the same time, once we know that we're distracted, then there's no need to sort of embellish upon it, and then we are actually back. So that's where, as we're sitting, we continually have this process of coming back to being present. So there's not really such a thing as a bad meditation or a good meditation, just that we're actually giving, you could say, doing ourselves a big favor in actually allowing ourselves to settle. So this is something that we could simply just regard this as an act of personal hygiene, psychological hygiene. We're not really doing anything sort of extraordinary. At the same time, it is a radical departure from our rather fidgety and restless way of continually being engaged. But it's radical in the sense that it departs from our ordinary unconscious and mindless sort of way of just being subject to all the various impulses and habitual impulses and ways of seeing things. So it provides for a greater perspective. And it's also a place where, despite us not doing anything, it actually provides a space in which our natural, you could say, creativity, our natural spontaneity, our natural insight has a space to flourish. We sometimes think that we become better on the basis of just regurgitating and reflecting and sort of keeping the mind very active, and we can resolve things psychologically. But very often we're just entangled in some very circular, repetitive patterns of the mind. What we're doing here is really just providing a fresh breath and a wider perspective. So it's a very different way of relating to the mind, and essentially it is a way in which we allow peace, and with that peace, greater clarity. Now, that's the sort of the bare bones of meditation, really. But something that we do in most Buddhist traditions is that we invoke a dimension of something greater. So, for example, in the Theravadan tradition, you might read sutras, and in the Tibetan tradition, particularly in the Vajrayana tradition, you very often engage in visualization practices of various kinds, which is really kind of like yoga. It's just like if you engage in a particular yoga position, then again, it affects your nadi, your prana, your bindu in a way that actually the mind also becomes increasingly clear. So in my tradition, what we very often do before meditation is invoke the Buddha. And we invoke the Buddha on the basis of visualizing the form of the Buddha, but not as sort of a how do you say, mystical higher entity, but really more as just the embodiment of the abiding innate condition that is uncontaminated by confusion. So invoking the Buddha and visualizing the Buddha externally is really just a way of invoking and bringing into presence this natural abiding potential that we innately possess. So we can do this through thinking of, even if some of us might think of Mahatma Gandhi, and even just thinking of Gandhi, you naturally have sort of a sense of something that is deeply meaningful. Or you might think of the Dalai Lama or something like that, where Ramana Maharshi, or something where there's just a sense of something really beautiful and meaningful that really touches on a deep level of truth. And so we have this practice that we do before we meditate here. And of course, it comes with a very strong bhakti language, which sometimes, say, us in the modern world, we've been sort of drilled to be incredibly critical and very tough in terms of what has genuine value and so forth. But I think we can probably get over that. It's a little bit, sometimes it's a bit like with love songs. If you're 7 years old and you hear schmaltzy love songs, you think it's absolute rubbish. But once you've sort of been hit by the virus once or twice, then you kind of, yep, they all make sense. You know, all those love songs, yep, they sound true enough. So similarly also with the language that you have, the very sort of bhakti or devotional language that you have, not just in the Buddhist context, but in many different traditions, actually speaks loudly about a dimension of invoking truth and invoking what's very real in terms of, you could say, the unconfused, abiding purity that the Buddha represents. So anyway, that's what we will do here. And we'll do that. And the format will be 15 minutes of sitting, and then 5 minutes of mindful walking, and then again 15 minutes of sitting. So we'll just take a 2-minute break, and then I'll set that up, and then we'll begin. Thank you. Okay. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering, and may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. As the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence, magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel-lined throne, in lotus, sun, and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, Lion of the Shakas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks, clad in the three Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture, his right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an almond bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent, he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The eight-closed sun, 16 elders and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings, circles him all around. Simply think of him and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the two extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues of body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed through beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings, accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teaching ceaselessly in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space, and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, I'm accumulating now, and will accumulate in the future. Keep going. Ever please, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the three jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Te yata o muni muni mahamunaya soha. 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 Om 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 muni muni mahamunaya soha. Muni muni mahamunaya soha. Om muni muni mahamunaya soha. From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations, and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to arise within, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. The miraculous display of the unsurpassable wisdom pierces the intentions, deeds, prayers, knowledge, love, and ability of all the Sugatas and their children. May all beings become exactly like them. And then down to the aspiration prayer of Maitreya. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas endowed with the divine eye of the sages and to the Shravakas as well. Keep going. And perfectly shows that whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in the realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. If the Bodhisattvas who reside in the 10 levels, in all the direction of the worlds in the 10 directions, to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma, so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those, supreme among humans, to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexalted enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dhammadhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings nor life force. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of the self. May I realize the Dhammatā where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping onto a self and mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity, free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity. By rules, an ethics that is completely pure, with an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, Bodhisattvas do not remain caught by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's stride, and through the samadhi that is like a bhaja, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the 3 times, and the 3 types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in a bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya and the kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, From the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish evermore and more. May the Buddha appear in this world. May the light of the teaching shine like the sun. May the holders of the teaching live in harmony. And thus, may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to belong. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya stiti yavat yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuya jagadukani nignata. Akashasya stiti yavat yavacha jagataha stitihi tavan mama stiti bhuyan jagadukani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyan jagadukani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyan jagadukani nignata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Thank you.
Thank you.